Hi, I'm Francis Vigent, and I'm joined today by my colleagues Judy Higgins and Lori Colpoys at KnowAtom. We're going to be discussing Mindset 3 from Cultures of Thinking and Action by Dr. Ron Ritchhart. The focus of this chapter is on creating a new story of learning and how we must change the role of the student and the teacher in that equation to create a new story of learning. Our discussion today is part of a series based on the anchor text, Cultures of Thinking and Action by Dr. Ron Ritchhart. Specifically today, we'll be talking about pages 53 to 73, and we'd encourage you to take a look at those pages if you're watching this recording, perhaps in advance or after the discussion, to go back and take a look at these ideas in more depth. Along with the discussion today, we are providing some additional supports, reflection questions, as well as a copy of this deck and discussion that you can share with your team. We encourage you to capture your thinking using a 4Cs model based on a thinking routine developed by Project Zero. As we go along, or as you go along in the reading, we'd encourage you to capture your thinking first in connections with your experience. Second, author's ideas that you challenge. Third, concepts that you think are worth considering. And fourth, changes that the author is suggesting as a way of shaping your discussion with your team. Jumping right in here, one of the first quotes that we wanted to talk about in today's discussion is this one here. Schools, from page 53, schools remain the way they are partly because students, teachers, and parents have become socialized in the established ways of doing things and have come to see established practices as necessary features of real school. One of the questions we want to lead off with is, what's meant by real school, and does it serve students well?
I think I can take this one, and I think I can do this one fairly quickly by identifying what do we mean by real school. And there's a really good visual on page 56 that talks about real school is sort of looking at the teacher as the deliverer of information, the manager of students' time and work. She or he is a disciplinarian, the evaluator, the speaker, and the rescuer when they think that's needed. And the students are basically vehicles just receiving the information. They're working to please. They're listeners, and they're most definitely confined by the curriculum. And they're also really being trained to avoid mistakes whenever possible. And does it serve students well? That's pretty much what we're going to be talking about for the next hour or so, in that, no, it doesn't serve students well. And as we move through the slides, we'll kind of make our pitch for why it doesn't serve students well and how can we do this better.
One of the things
Yeah.
that oh, I'm sorry, go ahead.
No, go ahead. Well, I was just thinking like the real school, it's even, I thought it's sort of even broader than that. It's just sort of those entrenched things that have been around for decades, everything. The book mentions student lockers to, 6 to 7 periods a day, grouped by age, and he does point out that, sort of the most entrenched practice, as Judy was pointing out, is that sort of teacher-centered instruction. And I think it brings to light sort of how difficult it is to dislodge those ways of operating that have been around for so long, and that's sort of a lot of what this chapter addresses.
Something about this quote that really jumped out at me in both, I guess I would say a positive and I don't know if I would say a negative way, but this word socialized, and I don't think it's a word that we use an awful lot to think about something as being socialized. And so it's a little bit off-putting. But what it's really talking about here is what's commonplace? What has become commonplace in the way that our society views school? And that is what comes to us through the way that school is portrayed in the media, TV, movie clips, clip art, stock images. think about it as you get a brochure about school. What's the picture that's on the cover? It, and when I think about that, I think about smiling, neat and clean, smiling kids, neat and clean classrooms, kids in seats, hands raised, books open, pencil in hand, expressions of awe and delight. And those aren't real. That's not real. That's not real classroom environment. Are there elements of that at times? Absolutely. But that is not what defines, in my mind, in my experience, real learning. And I think what's so challenging, and I think that this is a great spot to start, is that that commonplace definition of school actually creates a kind of barrier to productive struggle, because it's productive struggle is very different than what I just described. In many ways, productive struggle, I think people are afraid of it because it feels negative. It feels scary. When I think about productive struggle in my classroom, I would describe my classroom as active, collaborative, messy, frustrating at times. Errors are happening. There's ambiguity, there's uncertainty, there's partial success and confusion. And that's all authentic. And it's the kind of thing that if somebody was to put that on the front of a brochure for school, I think they would be afraid that people wouldn't sign up. But it's where the most learning comes from. And I think that's what we're going to spend this next hour or so talking about. And I think that a lot of what we're going to talk about is the shift to authentic teaching and learning, and not just the development of dispositions, but something that was mentioned in one of the earlier earlier chapters that we discussed in a different chapter, was this idea of cognitive emotions, where if we can engage students in productive struggle, if we can have that ambiguity, if we can be comfortable with that, we can make challenge fun and we can make it rewarding. And those are things that need to be socialized more in our schools. And so I think that's kind of coming back to this quote. I don't think that the clip art concept of school serves students well, but this other messier thing that's less commonplace does serve students well. But I think we need to be on the same page with administrators, as teachers, but also with parents about what that looks like, so that they're not expecting clip art. They're expecting something much more authentic. So I think that brings us to the author's guide in question here in this sort of chart. What type of learners are we promoting in our classrooms, and not just as teachers, but as administrators, or as board members, in our community? Are we looking to create students who are conforming perhaps to that clip art concept of school? Are we trying to get students that are engaged, or are we trying to get students that are empowered? And each of these things has a very sort of different a different teacher and student role, but also different success, a different kind of success. And I don't know, Judy, Lori, if you wanted to dive into this a little deeper now, if there's anything you wanted to add to it.
On the last slide, it's funny, my focus was more on that first part of if you go back to the other slides, is that schools, remain the way they are. And that's sort of what kind of jumped out at me, is how hard it is to dislodge this notion of what school is. And I think when I was reading it, that whole teacher-centered instruction, I think that's one of the hardest things to dislodge, is that teacher up at the front of the classroom, directing, instructing, explaining. And I think, that's what really stuck out to me. And when I look at the next slide, I would think a lot of people would think as conforming as just part of what has to happen, and that's that's how you get kids to listen and behave, and but when in reality, is that really what we want? Is that really going to engage and empower them? Sort of where I was going with that.
I think about the conforming as in the conforming school or classroom, we all share this vision of clip art. The kids in the desks, the hands up, the expression of awe, whatever. And so we have this motley crew of kids come into us, and we get them. Our job is to get them to conform. We grade them, we score them, we set expectations, we reiterate the standards. And so they're not in their desks with their hands up with expressions of awe at the beginning of the year, but by golly, come May or June, that's what success looks like. Did we get them to conform? And then in other situations, like this engaged level, are the kids participating? Are they excited? Are they essentially cooperating with the program? I feel like that's where sort of the engagement gets to. With the empowerment, I feel like empowerment is much more about this collaboration between student and teacher, where it's not about the teacher making connections for students and the students cooperating. That's what I see engagement as being about. Empowerment is about students identifying and co-creating in a sense. And I feel like empowerment is the rarest of all sort of environments to come across, particularly one that's stable. Like I think people reach into these sort of things at a lot of different points, but anyway, I'd like to share the floor. Judy, you look like you wanted to say something.
Well, actually, I wanted to go on to the next slide.
Sure.
That I think is important right after this, because so in this one, we're sort of looking at that page, and I thought that was so great. But this was a question that was so incredible for me to read, because I thought about that challenge teacher control, and it brought back this connection to me. I've been teaching for a long time, and things have changed, not nearly enough, but they have changed a lot. And so the author's statement, not a sequential progression, how does that challenge teacher control? Because it talked about these types of learners conforming, engaged, empowered. It's not a sequential progression. Many students overlearn the message of school, and students are compliant, conforming workers. It becomes very difficult to engage them. So when I read this question, I thought immediately of the me who was a teacher many, many years ago. I will defend myself in that. But I thought about this particular thing that happened. We had a new math program, and it was very different. It was very challenging for a lot of the teachers. But what happened to me very early on is it was this one particular student who was not in the sequential progression that my curriculum was telling me to teach and that I was teaching. And this particular student was way ahead, already knew a lot of this. I did not know what to do. Student. And he was trying to be empowered. And I sort of, and again, shame on me, I kind of looked upon that as that like troublemaker is, really. And it became clear to me that he really did know what he was talking about. And I did not know what to do. I was thinking, what do I do with him? How do I keep him busy? Do I just have him be a helper to other students, or do I break out the sixth grade curriculum to keep him busy? And I reflected upon this particular question so much, because I thought, I did not want to admit that to anyone. I didn't want to talk about this. I didn't know how to think about this student. And I thought about, and again, the curriculum may have given me ways to, I don't know, but I couldn't think beyond that. And I think about how stuck I was in the real school and how helpless I became at how I was going to, deal with this student. And that was, and again, this goes back to a talk we had with another mindset where I wasn't talking to other teachers who later on, as I overrode my shame and started talking about that, there were so many teachers that were going through the same things, and we weren't dealing with that. So it's incredible to think about, here I had this empowered learner, this empowered student, and I didn't know what to do with it.
Mm. It's interesting. I think about when I started as a high school teacher. I was a high school math teacher, and many of my students were my age. And I always thought about how here I was with a pension and a salary and a car and a job, and they're asking me to go to the bathroom for permission to go to the bathroom, and it just sort of struck me as this like unbelievable context. And then I think about a situation that I have had sort of similar to what you're describing, Judy, but I think even more basic was getting students into the classroom at the high school level was oftentimes an issue. And it felt like prison. I felt like I was a prison guard. It was like goal number one was to get students to conform to being in the classroom for 45 minutes, and these other things, engagement and empowerment and all of that. It was like it didn't even sort of register. And the thing that made it actually feel like a prison was, to your point, the students were fully capable, but there was no opportunity for them. They could be in that classroom and they were never going to be empowered.
Mhm.
And the curriculum was never going to engage them because it was geared at this gap filling, backfilling, worksheet type
Teacher
remediation,
directed,
teacher
teacher
directed. They had
explaining.
no voice. They had
Yeah.
no identity in it. They had no control. And so students realized that they could take control by not showing up, or they on a personal level, they could take control of the entire classroom by acting out. And to your point, Judy, it's at the root of a lot of behavior issues is this conforming informational model of teaching. And it's something that I've witnessed over and over, and something very early, my first 2 years of teaching, I experienced. And it's even down to the level of, if I can Google the answer to this, why are you asking me this question? And I think that speaks to a lot of other things we'll talk about here. But if Google has the answer, then my thinking or I really don't matter, because a robot could do this. Even if I don't know the answer, that I could go to Google just the same as you. But I feel like I feel like in my teaching, as I shifted towards being curious about students, listening to students, I felt like that curiosity and that listening, I was creating a space for them, and they actually felt that empowerment, and the kind of questions and things that I was curious about was about them. And I can't Google that. There's no Google of Jack. There's no Google of hope. And so I don't know. I just what spoke to me in this particular question about something of this not being a sequential progression and teacher control is that as a teacher in my first couple years of instruction, I would have thought that you have to get kids to conform if you're going to engage them. You have to engage them if you're going to empower them. And I've heard teachers say this sort of thing. Like, you can't have one without the other, so you need to start here, and it's like a ladder or like stairs. But it's that all of that is the foundation of it is teacher control. And when I think about my actual experience as a teacher, when I started focusing on, I hate to say it, caring and listening and being curious, it wasn't the kids, I don't know, the conforming and engaging weren't factors. It's like it all kind of happened at once. And I don't know that that's helpful for anybody, but it wasn't sequential at all.
I kind of separate it in my mind when I think of conforming, because school is institutionalized and kids have to walk in lines. And there's a reason kids walk in lines, so that, nobody's getting hurt and you have room. And even like your classroom routines, they do have to conform to routines. There's 25 of them in a classroom, but I kind of draw the line when it comes to the instructional part, where the teacher's in control of the learning, and again, it goes back to that teacher-centered instruction. So I get where it gets muddy for teachers, because there is some conforming that has to happen because there's 25 of you in a room, and you have to have certain rules to make it a safe, comfortable place to be. So I kind of separate it from that kind of conforming to, like, when it comes to the instructional part of the lesson. Does that make sense?
It does, Lori. And I think what happens, which is such a great thing, is when we start sharing that kind of conforming, that we do that with the students. If they, we might decide as a classroom, how are we going to show respect? And I think that's the difference between the quote unquote real/old school is just, here it is, but now as a group, because I think that is so powerful when kids can go, oh, okay, so there's, the teacher's not just telling us to be the power at the front. They're telling us, okay, this has to happen. And it's that working around, because there was a lot about that with the old school. It's kind of, there's certain times that we have to be in there, and there are certain things that we have to do, but as long as we're making students aware, this particular thing isn't in my control for these reasons. So how can we work around this? And I think I like that, what you said, because that is important, but also letting them into it.
Right.
And there's also, and we can move on to the next slide here, but there's also the things that you mentioned, Lori, like, walking in a straight line through narrow hallways. Like, these are just sort of basic protocols to, like you said, help other people be able to get around and keep people safe and things like that. But there are other things which students are sometimes required to conform to, which are in essence dehumanizing. I'll give you an example.
Right. That's what I was saying, is to, like, separate those two.
And you really do.
Not throw it all in the same basket.
Absolutely, yeah. but I don't think that this is a gray area, but I think it is a gray area for some people. Where one example that I would give is a school where I was doing professional development years and years ago, and the students were out at recess, and I overheard the teachers talking about a particular student, and they said, oh yeah, he was terrible today, he's out walking the line. And I said, what does that mean, walk the line? And I looked out at recess, and there's a big circle line, kind of like a rectangular circle line in the playground, and all the kids are kind of playing within the circle, and here's that student literally walking the circle like a line in a prison, around and around and around and around and around. So the message was to this student, you conform in class, or you conform with your time at recess and we'll dehumanize you. You take away your rights to play and have fun and all that sort of stuff, and you'll walk the line outside and you'll be the only one. And I just was so floored by that, because I think when you, these other ideas, I mean, it's, and in some respects, it's an example of sort of ultimate control in a way. But when we talk about engagement and empowerment, the very foundation of that is the person. And so, you know, like, think about what you're talking about, walking through the hallways. You know, that's one thing for safety. We're not removing the humanity, the person in that. That's
Right.
just, you know, whatever.
Right.
But when I think about these other things, often disciplinary tactics, they can be dehumanizing, and it removes the very foundation to engage or empower students and actually have a conversation and move beyond something sometimes. So thinking about this next quote here, just gonna kind of bring this down. Children who follow the rules out of obedience to authority and compliance are more likely to transgress when that authority is absent than those that adhere out of a sense of responsibility to their community. It's also important to acknowledge that we are not talking about a wholesale handing over of authority as we focus on engagement and empowerment, but rather a shift in how that authority is used. That shift is from a focus on control and obedience toward liberation, empowerment, and supporting students in seeing and thinking for themselves. And the question that we brought up here is, and this is from page 57, although the question's from page 65, to what extent are students allowed to be decision makers in a process? Or are all ideas and suggestions subject to my approval?
This is kind of what I was speaking to, is like the conforming of school rules is different than when it comes to learning. You know what I'm saying? Like, having students be decision makers in the process of thinking and learning, and not having the teacher direct that for them. I think that's what really stands out. It's hard not to think of the labs that we do in KnowAtom when I think of this, where we release responsibility to them, giving everyone the opportunity to think and make connections and to learn in the moment. And I think that's really what this is referencing.
Mm-hmm.
I agree. But I think also one of the issues that teachers, parents, administration often have is that they get so worried about, do we just hand over, the keys to the students and let them have it? And one of the quotes I liked so much in this reading was, the teacher does not have to lose power in order for students to gain it. And that to me was such an important quote to remember, that we're still, with KnowAtom, we're still doing a certain unit. We're doing a certain reading together. We certainly have expectations, but within those expectations, there are so many opportunities to release responsibility, for students to say, well, can I build the prototype that way? Sure, I have some questions. I'm curious, why you're going to do it that way. Have you thought about this? To take that opportunity to ask some questions and listen. But I think that's what often gets missed when people think we have to stay with real school, because there would be chaos without it. We still have, I mean, it's sort of uncomfortable, even the word power becomes, that feels uncomfortable. But to know that teachers can have power and students can have power. And I think that it's important to reassure everyone, we have thoughts about this when we are, if a student wants to be curious, we're not necessarily going to stop this class and follow that student's curiosity that is on a different subject. We're not going to do that, but we can certainly say, that sounds amazing. I'd love to talk about that more later. You can bring something in, you can talk to the class about it at some point. But at this point, we're doing XYZ. And within that, I wonder if you could make any connections to what we're doing with the thought that you're having.
It's interesting, Judy. You said a few minutes back, you said something about, you know, teachers afraid of chaos if they lose that power. And if you look at that first sentence, it's the complete opposite. There will tend to be more chaos because there'll be more dissatisfied students who, you know, if you're empowering them, it's going to be a more pleasant place to be actually in the classroom.
Yes.
You're going to have more children intrinsically motivated. And, you know, I think of conforming have to versus want to. You're going to have more wanting to than having to.
I couldn't agree more. Yeah, go ahead.
Just let me jump on what Lori said, because yes, but Lori, the three of us have talked about that so much. People could sometimes look into our classrooms and perceive this as chaos. And that's sort of, I feel like, you know, there needs to be education around that too. It's not chaos because we're not making them be in their seats. It's not chaos because they're all talking at once, and you know, I might be on the other side of the classroom with a group, and this group seems to, you know, have they got, you know, are they getting no help? So it's sort of, there's a lot, I think, in this mindset that we have to change a lot of thinking. It's not chaos. It's, as you said, it's a lot of really excited, curious learners that we're looking at.
I think about a beehive when I think about my classroom. I think about how I think in my first 2 years of teaching, I was trying to get kids to conform. I was trying to be the you know, the clip art teacher, because that's what was like around me. That was seen as what the model was. But as I had better leadership in where I was working and better mentors and was getting experience myself as a teacher, I think that my class became more like a beehive. And I think it's easy to look at a beehive and be like, yeah, that's chaos. But if you really look at it, everybody's filling a role. And in some respects, it's a self-appointed role in making that community function. And so when I think about like KnowAtom and using KnowAtom in my class, I had Socratic dialogue going on where students were bringing their ideas to the table and working with them, and working with others' ideas, and agreeing and disagreeing, and using conditional language. And those were not things I was making them do in a puppeteer sense. It was things that they were doing because they were building dispositions and using them, but they were genuinely curious. And that's how as a community, our class functioned to get things out of our science time on learning. That's how we did science. And then, you know, we would have these partners. And so in a partnership, that was a miniature community. And so, you know, both people's ideas mattered, but we had to come to consensus, and we had to be able to explain our choices, and all of those things had a lot of meaning. So when I see this quote, and I see this, you know, a sense of responsibility to community, I think about that. But I even think about, like, in the disciplinary context, where we might be having a discussion, particularly early in the year. This sort of thing would happen, especially if I had new students that hadn't had KnowAtom before. And a student would say something that, share an idea that was kind of preposterous. You would get a student who might laugh or snicker or do something that was kind of, you know, just out of line. And I just remember in that moment, it was not the student only offending the student that they were snickering at, but it was really offending the community. And so I remember stopping at points and saying, you know, Judy, when I see you snicker at a student who's sharing their ideas, it makes me think that you're judging their idea and that you're making fun of them. And you know, that we don't do that here. And that sort of reinforcement of what the community is about is just so important to have those kind of conversations with students one-on-one, as opposed to sort of sending them out to walk a line, that some people might take. And the other thing that jumped out at me in this one too is the shift in how authority is used. It's like, as a teacher, I can use my authority to be an enforcer, or I can use my authority to create a conversation around, what do we want our community to be like? Do we want to be open to considering all ideas? And if an
Right,
idea
your
might
authority, like as a role model, more like a role
exactly
model.
exactly it might seem preposterous. I remember I had a student, this is a story I haven't shared in a while, but I used to share it a lot, where we were talking about matter, and I had two bags. One was corn and the other one was rice or something like that, or sand. And I said, are these made of the same things? How do we know? What would we look at to try to figure out if they're different? And I remember, the kids would talk about the shape. They might look at the shape of the particles. They'd look at the color. They'd look at different things. And one student said that he thought that they were very different, because we had talked about there being different elements and how elements have different characteristics. And one of those characteristics is the mass of the element. So, gold has more mass than silver, and they also have different colors. And he said that the corn that I had looked like it was golden, and this other substance that I had looked kind of silvery. And he said that because the characteristic of the different elements have different colors, that there could be gold atoms in this corn, and there could be silver atoms in this other stuff that I had. And so that would mean that they definitely had different mass, and they were definitely made of different substances. And so, while the premise of there being, gold in the corn and silver in this other thing, is definitely not true, it was an interesting point of discussion and connections for a third grader to make. And that's, again, like, this was a third grader who was on a very heavy IEP and was oftentimes answering questions from in the closet, because that's where he liked to be, and that was fine. We all sort of respected that. And he would literally, get in the corner of the closet, and we'd hear the coach talking at us. But the reality is that was our community, and we all had authority to and power to share. And I just I see this in particular, this question where it says about subject to my approval. And I think about, as a teacher, it's less about approval. I think that oftentimes as teachers, we get up and we want students to give us answers or give us things that conform to what we want. And I think that that's where it all breaks down. Like, if we want all our kids in seats, for me to have my little guy sitting behind the coats in the closet, still shouting out his answers, doesn't conform to that concept of school. So I can get in a fight with him all day long and waste everybody else's time about having him sit in his seat, or I can just let him shout out from behind the coats, and he's just part of the community, and it's just what it is, and it was fine. But looking, I don't know if we want to move on to the next quote here, but I think it kind of connects with teachers holding all the power and making all the decisions in the classroom. Students' level of engagement decreases significantly. In addition, such environments don't provide students with the opportunities that they need to develop as independent, self-regulating learners capable of decision-making, critical thinking, or creativity. And the question that we put forward here was, what about giving packets that students can choose what they do in the packet? Is that the kind of power and decision making that we're talking about here?
I would say that, do you want to do this work, or this work is not the opportunity that they're referring to? I think choice should allow students to grapple with ideas, think on their own, do critical thinking, do problem solving, and simply choosing this or that is not that kind of engagement or opportunity that this quote's referring to. I
Yeah.
don't know if you guys would agree.
This, though, I did have to say a little bit in defense of packets, because I had, again, it was again, still the way old days, but Miss Higgins was starting to learn about how do I deal with these kids that already know stuff. And we were big into packets in our school, like packets was all over the place. And I decided to be a little bit of a rebel. And I look at this with such fondness. So I decided we're still going to use a packet, because that was kind of what you were supposed to do with this reading program. And we sort of collectively decided as a classroom, we were going to use a packet for they had, this was ELA, we had all read a book together, and they were going to create their own assessment. And we had a great conversation, because all of a sudden my classroom came alive with all these questions. And I was like, yeah, this feels like, what kind of things do you think you'll be looking for? And the kids were saying, well, we want to make sure that we all read it. We all want to make sure we understood it. We all want to, maybe talk about like what was our favorite part. And so we sort of kind of set out some loose ground rules, but then it became everybody could make their own assessment. We'd put it into the packet, and then students could choose from the packet which one they wanted to do for their assessment. I learned so much as a teacher and a listener that day, because the kids did it. They had a blast. It was so creative, and talk about, creating students that have a place in the world. These kids that hadn't said a word all year, this one student had this idea to like make a picture of your favorite scene, and the students just went wild. Like first they were like, was that okay? Can he do that? And yes. And the learning that went on, but I also felt like, for me as a teacher, the listening that went on as students were creating their final assessment. And then after we did the assessment, we discussed it. And we didn't do discussions. We didn't have those sorts of things. It was so much fun. And it was so much fun to see the thinking, not only about the book, because that was tremendous, what the discussion that happened in the book. And again, students that I wasn't sure if they understood it, all kinds of thinking, all kinds of questioning was going on, but also the more, like, I felt like the really important things where students talked about being afraid that nobody was going to choose their assessment about that. And it was just, it made our classroom come together, and it became this really fun thing where students were saying, oh, I didn't even see that one. Can I take that one home and do it and bring it back tomorrow? So it came that they were doing way more. They had been required by me to choose two. And all of a sudden they had kids, taking them home, and parents were saying, what is going on? My kids are so excited. They're talking about this book so much. So it was such a powerful, on so many levels, for me as a teacher to think about, even within the parameters of, you got to have packets, that we can maybe, inch our way outside of that a little bit and think about, can I give them a little bit more freedom if I'm required to do packets? How can myself and my students think about making this more of a learning process, more of something that I can enter at my level?
It's funny, Judy, you would have the packets that were not really packets the way people
I was just
do
going to
them.
say, I was just going to say, that wasn't, to my point earlier, that wasn't a
The
packet.
unpacket.
Because it was
Yes,
creativity.
sorry for doing that.
It
I
was
just couldn't resist.
creating their own thing. Like, when I think of packets, I just think of piles of work is, is what I think of. That's very teacher directed. What you described was not that.
Right.
No, and I guess I was in defense of, like, if you got packets, we can still work with this somehow.
Yeah, right. Well, and I think it speaks to how do you, within the confines of being required by an administrator to do packets, how do you make those packets something that creates opportunities for students to be independent, self-regulating, and engage in this decision making and creativity. And my answer to this question is that the way that people, to your point, typically do packets as a collection of worksheets, and it's like, it is what it is. That the idea that it is in some way power and decision making for students is a misinterpretation of what I think is meant here by of student agency, period.
Right.
Because for students to have agency and power and decision making, it requires the opportunity to create something. And it's something that's novel, that has personal meaning, and it's not
Or even
necessarily
problem solving.
Yeah, it can be problem solving, but if you're solving the problem the teacher wants you to solve in the way that the teacher wants you to solve it, that's just a packet. That's just a fill in the blank by another way, another definition. But if as a student, I have the opportunity to create something novel that's not necessarily what my teacher wants or envisioned, now you've done something special. You've created an opportunity for me, and with boundaries. As a teacher, I have to create safety. I have to create boundaries in different ways. I think about, in the context of KnowAtom, I used to have students come up to me and they'd be like, "We can think of this thing, but we need a material that we don't have." And so the materials, if someone teaches KnowAtom, you know that you have a certain budget of materials for each team, and that's what they have to work within. Well, what I would do is I'd say, you know what? I will let you pick up to 3 things from the recycle bin. And so if you can find something in that recycle bin that can meet your need for what you want to do, in addition to the materials that you have, you can add it to your materials list and go for it. And so there were some boundaries. It had to come from the recycle bin. It had to be, up to 3 of these things. But it created an additional layer of opportunity, self-regulating, decision-making, so on and so forth, which they already had. But it was just another opportunity, and the kids loved it. And it created this variation because, there might only be 1 bottle in the recycle bin. So if you were the team that got the bottle, well, then the thing you made could incorporate that bottle, where somebody else might be left with, 3 crumpled up tinfoil balls, and, yet they could do something with that. And so I didn't know what they would choose. I didn't know what they would do with it, or if it would even matter. But that was I think that was kind of the magic of it. It was that they were even more engaged because they had this kind of authentic agency. And I think back to if I took that away and said, no, you have to make the thing like I made, which I didn't do,
Right.
but in some classrooms, teachers do this. We're going to make this today, just like me. Watch. 4
Step
wheels,
1,
2
step
things.
2.
Step 1, 2.
Yeah.
Oh, yours doesn't look like mine. Go back and take a look at mine. See if you can fix it. That engagement decreases in those environments. You get more behavior issues because the kids like where do I matter in this? I'm just assembling something that you made for a second time. I've seen that play out so many times.
I think that's really cool too, Francis, that you added in this other special thing that's going to increase the curiosity and the thinking for the rest of the year, because it's like, can we get into the recycling?
Right.
So I mean, it's just like throwing in that, a little bit of extra special sauce to, so I think that's really cool, because that's sort of removing one more boundary that, we're not totally, have to just use these materials. So I think that's really a fun, cool way to up that curiosity quotient.
And the last thing I'll mention on this is I think it speaks to the quote that you mentioned earlier about sharing power doesn't mean losing power, and giving power to students doesn't mean giving up power. It's I gave the power and I gave the trust to them to make a decision. I gave some boundaries around the 3 and the recycle bin, but I didn't control the decisions. I didn't control whether they used it or not and how they used it. And
You widened their problem solving skills.
yeah, exactly. It was truly sharing and increasing. It wasn't, half for you and half for me. It was one
Right.
for me and one for you. So we have 2 now. This next quote, oh, go ahead. I'm sorry.
No, I was just going to say, Judy, your school never had paper rationing like our school did. That was probably the best thing that happened to our school was when we
Yeah,
were rationed on paper, there was no more packets. We had to get really creative.
Yeah, yes.
So looking at the next quote here, when the learning environment promotes classroom talk, students are consistently explaining and justifying their thinking, encouraging deep learning that mere didactic instructions cannot achieve. And the question that we raised here was, how can I give my student more support structures, language, or tools to help them assume a greater role in leading discussions? And if I can jump on this quote to kind of, I think, challenge the author a little bit in what is classroom talk? Because I think that there is a huge spectrum of the kind of talk that happens in classrooms, and some of it is very worthwhile and productive, and others not so much. And I guess what I would challenge the author here is that, similar to in other chapters where he talked about soft collegiality and hard collegiality, there is truly soft talk and hard talk. And hard talk in classrooms, I think, is far more rare than soft talk. And an
Are you
example that I would,
talking teacher to teacher, Francis, or are you talking kids?
I'm talking kids,
Oh,
but
okay.
it can kind of go both ways. But I think, and I'll give an example of turn and talk. So, in a turn and talk, you can have, students coming into the classroom, come in, welcome to science, come in, get your seat. I want you to turn and talk with your partner about what we did in science last week. You know, okay, everybody's in the room. Okay, I want you to share. What did we do last week? We talked about, atoms and molecules and this and that. And okay, great. So today what we're going to do is X, Y, Z. That's a soft talk situation where the value is really low. There's, I don't, promoting that type of classroom talk is not requiring students to explain and justify. It's not encouraging deeper learning. There may, and in some ways that it's driven by instructions, come in, do this, do that, so on. But a lot of even administrators will go into classrooms and see something like that and say, oh, classroom discussion is happening, so on, and it kind of checks the box. So I view that as soft talk. What I view as hard talk is, we could take the same exact scenario. Students come in, I want you to get with your partner. I want you to talk about, one way that you saw states of matter happening this morning. Since our last class, where did you see a phase change in the state of matter? And you can have students talk about that, but then getting students to share and explain and justify. So a student might share out something like, well, the snow melted. But, we had snow the other day, it fell in a pile, and then this morning I noticed on my way to school that the snow was melting. And so that melting snow was a phase change of matter from a solid to a liquid. So you could stop right there, or you can invite the student to explain and to justify how that's a phase change, and whether and how other students agree or disagree with it, and where would that tell us more about where the energy is coming from to make that happen. so on and so forth. To me, that's much, I would call that hard talk, where we're really getting in and exploring, and students can't engage without explaining and justifying. And I'm
I
giving an
think,
example that's very teacher directed, but go ahead.
yeah, and I think you said something important is, talk is a way of thinking with other people. You can't have a talk with yourself. So, when I think about a teacher's role, I think creating a classroom where there's community talk, and you're not only, in order to talk with others, you have to listen with others too. So it's not just kids popcorning ideas out there, but helping kids bring their ideas together to think together. And I think that's can be tricky, but that's the real sauce, is when they're thinking together.
But I think it's really important. Again, and say another quote that I wrote down with regard to this question: we cannot expect behaviors from our students that we have not developed and supported. That we have to make that a routine. We have to teach them how to talk, and
we have to talk less.
how to listen.
Yeah.
We have to talk less, yes, absolutely. But we have to begin by doing some modeling, and by giving them the kind of, sentence frames, supports that are going to help them understand that, it's expected that if you say something, you have to talk about why you're saying this. Where did you find this? Tell us more about that. And to say, I remember, when we first started practicing, and we were encouraging everybody to participate, and students would just simply say, well, yeah, I agree with whoever just talked. And to say, well, let's talk about why, and are there, adding on, and whose thinking has changed after we talk about that. So I think that's a place where we want to spend a lot of our time modeling, supporting with how to do this, because it's very challenging for a lot of students, because a lot of students haven't said a word in the classroom for many, many years. They talked like crazy when they were kids, but then that stopped. And there's a lot of really
I think
sad.
school's to blame for that.
Yeah, well, that's what I was just going to say.
Real school.
Yeah,
Right.
There's so much disturbing data that talks about the amount of questions a 3-year-old asks in an hour,
Right.
and then, which is hundreds, and then
Yeah.
how much an 11th grader, which is, maybe in a day, how many questions they might ask. So
It's
I think
the QRE pattern that kills it. It's called IRE or QRE, where the teacher asks a question, the teacher student answers, they evaluate. It's like
when,
quiz show where students are really put on edge, and it's valuing those that have the quick answers, that have the strong vocabulary, and it just shuts down everybody else.
Right. And the delight of when you give students support, and students realize, one, asking a question is part of a discussion, because students would always say, well, I don't understand anything. How can I join in? Well, you can join in by saying, hey, I need help with this. I don't understand. So I think that that's a place where modeling an opportunity is so important, to have those routines where, we're going to have lots and lots of small, maybe talks with your partner, but larger whole class talks about all kinds of things.
Right. What if the product that we're after is really the discussion? If it's really using the dispositions, attempting the dispositions that we're trying to build. And as teachers, as much as kids, I think about discussions, and I think about how, to your point, Judy, how things like Socratic dialogue, people struggle with it so much. And oftentimes it's because the only model of discussion that's ever been seen is this ping pong Q&A, the IRE, QRE model that Lori mentioned. you ask the question, I give the answer, and then you tell me if you liked it. Like that's a very hard, you can't innovate. You can't engage in these sort of higher level discourse, but also just creativity with that approach to life. So I think about what you're saying, Judy, and suggesting modeling and creating the opportunities and helping students. And I think of it as helping students step into the role of this hard talk and questioning, and not in a didactic way. And that's what I love about the way you described it. It's not that you're treating students like puppets and saying, okay, we're going to have a puppet discussion, and then later on you're going to have a real discussion. That's didactic. It's actually, as the teacher, I'm going to model, I'm going to identify the learning, I'm going to identify the opportunity, I'm going to share the kind of expectations that we have. Like, this is going to feel a little uncomfortable. Ideas are going to come into your mind, and I want you to share them. Questions are going to come into your mind, and I want you to share them. And you know what? They might be connected, they might not be connected, and that's okay. We're all going through this together. Like that is not didactic. That is community building. And it's explaining to students that this is not about conformity. And I think that, like, to your point, Judy, when you take a 3-year-old and you look at the number of questions, and then you look at a high schooler, or dare we look at adults, even worse, how few questions are asked. It's that they have been trained on conformity.
Right.
It's been trained out of them by the system.
Yeah.
And I think the best thing you can do, how can I give my students more supports? I think being a model of listening. You can't talk with others if you don't listen. And
Right.
even, Judy, you mentioned sort of those facilitated questions, what makes you say that? Well, tell me more. That's in response to listening, So I think that's one of the best things I started doing when I felt more confident in teaching, was sitting back and talking less and listening more. And I think that's one of the best things a teacher can tell themselves every day is talk less, listen more.
That was one of the things that actually on the next slide is, I think, a great connection here. I'll just kind of read this quote so that if people can't read it, they get a sense of what's here. On average, teacher talk constitutes 70 to 80% of all talk done in classrooms. When teacher talk dominates, students are swiftly disenfranchised by hierarchical models of education, which inhibit curiosity and initiative. Without opportunities to talk, not only are students unable to clarify their understandings, but also teachers lose the chance to monitor learning and intervene appropriately. Listening, and this is, I think, one of the most powerful parts of this whole thing for me, listening is the zone in which inquiry happens, in which questions arise and tug at us, and the seeds of ideas germinate. And I think about listening as being how we learn our students. It's how our students learn, but it's also how we learn our students. What do we even know about them, and what they understand and what they think, if we're not listening? And so one of the things I circled in the book and wrote next to this quote was, at the top, what if we flipped it to 70 to 80% of all the listening done in the classroom was done by the teacher? What would our talk as teachers consist of? What would you spend if you spent that 70 to 80% of the time listening? What would you spend your 20 to 30% of talking? Especially like if it was questioning. Like I think about, like, what kind of questions could we ask?
Yeah.
How much more talk could we drive?
I wouldn't be in the quiz show mode. I know that. I wouldn't spend that 20, 30% asking review questions.
Right. Oh, that drives me crazy. Every time I walk into a classroom and I hear the review questions, I'm just like, ah.
And there's such an assumption too that everybody else is sitting there going, yes, okay, like I understand that. Now that that student gave that answer, it's 100% clear to me.
Right. It's part of this, what do we call it? The real school, right? We have to do the review. But this question is the one that we brought up for the slide is, what opportunities can I create that will help students practice, recognize, and understand the power of listening? So previously we were talking about talking. Here, it's really about the power of listening.
They're synonymous to me. You can't talk if you don't listen, right?
Well, yeah, one of the things, and I feel like, Laura, you might have mentioned this, but it was mentioned in the book, and I really liked it, where they talked about conversation mapping, and where you're literally, from line to line, who's talking when, we've got a circle. I watched this happen in a classroom, and clearly this teacher had been doing it for a while. And so after the discussion, the teacher, and this was clearly a routine, the teacher just put that was over on the side, and she said, I've got the conversation mapping, so, in your free time, check it out. Every single student, when they had a moment, they went over and they thought so much about that, and they talked about at what point were they talking, at what point were they listening, did they listen, did they talk, and they questioned themselves a lot, because I was having a ball going like, what are you thinking as you're looking at this? And it was so powerful, because I assumed that was just to sort of identify the kids who weren't talking. They could identify it and they could think about it. And again, clearly the teacher had done her work with this one, because a lot of the kids would talk about, I didn't talk very much, but I know I listened a lot because my thinking changed, and they were using all that kind of conversation. And I thought, that is not something that I ever used. And that is definitely something, to answer that question, that I would absolutely start using in my classroom, and having students think about, if you weren't talking, what was going on, and what did listening feel like, and to have discussions to celebrate listening, because we spend a lot of time celebrating talking, and to really celebrate and call out is, not talking doesn't mean you're not paying attention necessarily. There might be a lot of good listening going on. So to highlight and celebrate it.
I think that what we just talked about a moment ago, that asking questions to get, I almost think about it as like you ask questions to get things to listen to, but you want to ask questions to get things to listen to that you don't know the answers to. Like that's in many ways, like as a teacher, like if I ask a question of a student, like, tell me more about that. What makes you think of rolling downhill when you think of gravity? I don't know what makes them think of rolling downhill when they think of gravity. I'm genuinely curious about that, and I'm really interested to figure out what connections that they're making, and how they see this connected, but also where this is going to go. And
it's not, I'm sorry to interrupt,
no,
Francis, but that process of them articulating their thoughts, it does a couple things. It does something for you as the teacher, but sometimes when kids are processing and articulating their thoughts, that's a learning process in itself for them. Because had you not asked that question, they might not have even made that connection of why do I think of that?
Yes.
So there's so much power when you ask those types of questions for the student's process of learning.
Absolutely. And it's surfacing their ideas, making them visible to themselves. They're getting into others, and it's creating an opportunity for them to clarify their thinking in the moment, but also for others to clarify and to have ideas sparked by that contribution, and then to ask, to inquire, or
because
to
somebody
explore.
might disagree. Somebody might say no to that, but that's not, he might say, well, it's because of this, and somebody else might take exception to that.
Exactly. So when I think about answering this particular question about, the opportunities I can create to help students practice, recognize, and understand the power. It's definitely modeling, but I also think of identifying what we talked about a second ago, identifying the thinking, identifying the learning, identifying the dynamic is in terms of, like, I think about a Socratic dialogue. Identify the thinking, the learning, the dynamic that this is about quickly, and then share that power, give that power, let that safe space be there, and let students actually engage authentically, and let them know what success looks like. Success is not giving the answer to the question in the back of the book or matching the word to the definition. Success is actually, it's working, it's I mean, it's kind of hard to it's kind of hard to wrap into words, but it's exploring, it's inquiring, it's connecting, it's
I think
all
it's
of these
also,
things.
I think it's also important for the teacher to celebrate. I mean, teachers spend a lot of time celebrating right answers, and there's obviously so much research about that not being healthy, but celebrating the conversation when kids are grappling with ideas or struggling with ideas or revising their thinking, and celebrating the power of community and how that helps kids formulate their thoughts. And I think that's something a teacher can really do in Socratic dialogue, is celebrate those kinds of moments, not, oh yeah, right answer, you're so smart, you know.
Right. Yeah, validating the smartness of somebody or something.
Right.
In the supports, I think about, like, a KnowAtom, the supports being things, they're structures that create common language or some boundaries. I think about things like picture thinking routine. I think about things like concept mapping, sentence frames. They're really helping students with tools to engage their creativity. Like, I think about it, it's like a cell phone has a camera in it. You could go take a picture of anything you want. Everybody's got the same camera, but think about the level of creativity that can occur, and just the depth and breadth of what can be captured. And I think about something like picture thinking routine or concept mapping. So many different things can be captured, or so many different things can be expressed in sentence frames. They're merely a tool to help students engage their creativity in that context, I guess.
Agreed.
Well, and I think also, I think of another, we talked about this at another mindset where I talked about this girl who was able to say, you changed my thinking. And that teacher was able to say, you listened. And that's how your thinking was changing. And I love that she highlighted that, you know, we connect that. You know, she changed your thinking because you stopped and you listened to this person.
Highlighting that and not the other person who was,
yes,
you know, had the concept correct.
Yes, exactly.
Yeah.
Exactly. And that everybody got rewarded. The person who
Right.
persevered and defended his thinking, but everybody was rewarded in that situation. So it wasn't you won and you lost, but we both did some really great work here.
And I think that comes to our next quote here. For students to develop a sense of initiative, self-efficacy, and resilience, they must be given the roles that require those skills. At the same time, we must be careful of assuming the role of rescuer, in which we rob students of the opportunity to develop these attributes. Too many students today find themselves ill-prepared for the rigors of university and professional life as they've grown up in a culture of safetyism, which leads to more fragility and less resilience. How am I creating an environment and opportunities that require initiative, self-efficacy, and resilience? I think that fits in with what's being shared here, and I think what you were saying, Judy.
I think it's all about the design of the lesson that you're creating. It speaks to that whole notion of, you know, having students, the figuring out versus the learning about. And again, that more student-centered versus teacher-centered environment. I think that's, you know, that's at the heart of it. I also think, you know, I think the book spoke about this too, that teachers fear when students struggle, that the teacher fears that they're feeling like that there's a lack of support from the teacher, and
Right.
that's our role. That's why we go into teaching, is you like to help, and you like to, but I think that's sort of the reason behind. And I had lots of student teachers over the years, and I think that's the biggest area that I would always have to work on with student teachers, is the over helping and the over supporting. Yeah, that's, I think when you're first starting out, that's your natural inclination, is to just jump in and help. It's not natural, I think, for some people to sit back and let the students struggle a little bit.
Yeah. How many teachers do you hear when people ask, why do you want to become a teacher? Oh, I like to help kids.
Exactly.
Right.
Exactly.
Please go find something else to do.
I know, exactly.
Yes.
But it's that weird place where you don't want them to go home and feel frustrated and unsupported, but you've got to find that magical spot where they're, and there's a whole chapter on, learning happens at the point of challenge. That's a
Yes.
whole topic in itself. But,
Yes.
this chapter is more on the teacher's role, and I think some teachers need to, redefine their role, not as, rescuer.
Right.
And I think
oh God, sorry, Judy.
we talk about sort of celebrating things, and I think, and again, we'll get into that when we get to that mindset, but I think to be able to celebrate struggle is, can completely shift that student who's feeling terrible, where it's like, wow, you are just working so hard with it. This is a really great struggle. And I think to normalize that this is okay. And of course, we're going to provide supports as needed. And that's why a teacher has to listen. So we can be clued into, is a support needed at this point, but not to jump to that, which, as you say, Laurie, I so agree about, student teachers, because it's hard. It's hard to watch that, but to see the power to watch a student finding their place in this world as they struggle through something and then solve it. When we can witness that a few times, we can say, ooh, this is good. This is okay for me to step back. I can encourage them, but not rescue. That's the difference.
So I'm going to throw a curveball here. I don't want to let the administrators out of the room on this one. So how about teacher teams?
Say more. What do you mean?
Well, I think about the quote that you just mentioned, and I think about this quote, and I think about the culture of safetyism that can happen in schools, where as teaching teams, our culture, our community suffers because there is the safetyism that comes into play, where it's like, oh, this new program is, it's stretching me. And basically, when people get stretched, do we swoop in to save people, or do we lean into the challenge and we begin processing that stretch and say, where is this coming from? Where is this an opportunity for growth? Is this a legitimate roadblock? And as an administrator, do I swoop in to save them, or do I play the role of thought partner? Do I engage my team in discussion and build the community and build the understanding and build the resilience so that we can be more adaptable, more skilled? And I think about something you shared previously, Laurie, about having taught during COVID and how everybody was sort of thrown out of the boat at the same time. Everybody was new at everything, and how it was this incredible growth opportunity and incredible learning opportunity, and how so much good came out of that, and how that was kind of a rich experience in a lot of ways, despite the negative of COVID happening here. And I think about how we could just kind of look not so distant past, like how up in arms people would be about things like Common Core, or they'd be up in arms about this or up in arms about that. And there was this kind of discomfort that instead of people processing the change and processing the realities and processing these sort of things and adapting practices or, whatever had to happen, there was a large group of people that just came out and tried to swoop in and kill it because
griped about it and
all this sort of stuff
Yeah.
because that was the skill set that they had.
Was uncomfortable.
It went
Yeah.
to this place of safety. If we feel discomfort, therefore we're not supported, therefore, and that.
And we all know when we feel challenged in the moment, it sometimes doesn't feel great, but
Right.
we also, when we reflect back on it, we know that's our biggest area of growth. That's when we can recognize growth.
Exactly.
That's what we have to let our students know.
Exactly. And I think that's the parallel sort of to one of our earlier discussions. For classrooms to be cultures of thinking for students, schools need to be cultures of thinking for teachers. If we're swooping in to save teachers from discomfort, how are we modeling for teachers the expectation that they should have for students, that we don't swoop in to save them, but we actually help them engage in a productive struggle, and that's the way these dispositions and understandings are built. So.
But I think we also, just to add in, because this is so important, we talked about last time, the importance of creating a safe environment so your brain works, because our brains aren't working.
Right.
So I think for administration, as opposed to thinking about, I'm going to swoop in and save them, well, I don't know that I need to save them, but I know that I need to create a safe environment by saying, this is I know we've got this new curriculum, it's challenging, and we've got X, Y, Z. And Laurie, I think I've thought so much about when you talked about that story, you all created a safe environment together because you were all talking about, we're a mess, this is so hard. But you were all in it together. I had an idea for this, and we're sharing. And so everybody's brain continued to work in some way with what you went through, and your kids' brains continue to work based on, and you've got the data with scores. That I think that was such a powerful story. So I think often we're looking for the wrong thing. We want to do this, that, and the other thing, when I feel it all starts with safety. We have to create a safe environment so everybody can think. And now we can move forward. And it's a lot easier when I'm scared or overwhelmed. At least if I feel safe, okay, I'm not in this alone. I don't have to learn this tomorrow. This is going to take some time. So we have to think about what does saving look like?
Right. And I think I think what I hear you saying too is that leadership doesn't create anxiety. Leadership creates, similar to what we were talking about with the students, it creates a sense of what the learning opportunity is, what the challenge is. And it's like recognizing, it's like, yes, this is new. Yes, this is different. Yes, this is challenging. Yes, this is stretching, but that's all normal. That's okay. It might feel uncomfortable, but I'm not judging you on your ability to do this day one. I'm expecting you to engage the challenge and to bring your learnings back to our community and to bring your questions back to our community so that we can work together on X, Y, Z, because that's what reduces that anxiety. And so it's like, what I hear you saying is the safe space, but I also hear you saying that leadership creates that. And so it makes me wonder, again, like as administrators, like how are we taking that challenge on in leadership, or are we not? Because I think I've seen it go both ways. And I wouldn't say that it's intentional. It's just an easily overlooked thing. Just jumping on here to the next slide we had. consider a classroom in which a good student is seen as someone who is quick with the right answer and completes all their work. In such a setting, asking what if questions may attract disapproval, if not scorn, from both teacher and other students. Curiosity, which should be seen as a strength, gets characterized as disruptive, annoying, and off task because it interferes with the teacher's getting through the lesson. And I've seen this hundreds of times where student shares something, teacher has a plan, doesn't listen to it, doesn't hear it, sort of says, oh, thanks, and like continues on and misses a huge opportunity and connection there. I've done it myself. You get caught up in the moment if you're in that teacher mode. But the question here is, how am I feeding students curiosity to drive their learning?
I think it goes back to, it's all what you promote and celebrate in your classroom. And I'm gonna sound like I'm repeating myself.
Mm-hmm.
But, you know, promoting questions, promoting thinking deeply, grappling with ideas, celebrating when kids do that, and staying away from the QRE. And I think it's all about equaling the playing field for your students.
Yeah,
Right.
and I think, Francis, you gave such a great example earlier of, can we have this idea, but we need one more thing. So you could have squashed that. Nope, sorry. That was really great, curious thinking, but nope, no can do. And you embraced that and really rewarded that. I mean, again, I just keep thinking of like, whoa, the recycling bin. This is so of all the ridiculous things. It's so wonderful. And, you know, that certainly, because again, now you've got kids who I can imagine every single time thinking, how do we get there? So it's taking advantage of, like, you saw an opportunity and jumped on it. And I would think it had even more impact than you would have thought.
Mm.
Those opportunities and being aware of, this is a great opportunity that I can do, and it's rewarding their curiosity big time.
I think about, for myself, it's like, am I willing to break with conformity and that common idea of school?
Mhm.
Because when I see these situations that just play out over and over again, of the teachers got the plan, so on and so forth, and it's like, nope, like student, nope, we just nope. And it's the teacher's need for personal conformity to that real school, or it's whatever it is, just conformity to their plan. I don't care about where the real school concept. It's like, it's that need for personal conformity. It gets upset when students don't conform. It's like, I have my plan, why aren't you conforming with it? It's like, and I think when we get in that situation, that's the danger that shuts down feeding the curiosity, I think. Because to your point, I could have just said, no, you can't have anything. Like, they might have even come to me with the idea of the recycling bin. I just say, no. Like, this is the plan, we're sticking to it.
It makes me think when I first used KnowAtom, and the kids would be, it's kind of embarrassing, but the kids would be like, can we use duct tape? And I would go to the manual and I'd be like, wait a minute, let me look. No, you can't, you know? And then it's like a few years in, I was like, well, tell me why you want to use duct tape and what do you want to use it for? But in the beginning, it was like, I don't know, can you?
Right. I'm going to get in so much trouble if I use it.
Right. Oh
and
my goodness.
Like, what was I afraid was going to happen? It's so ridiculous.
You know, and that's exactly it. It's like, and I think about that, like, what's the worst that can happen? You know, like really, you know. But
I think that's the personality of most teachers.
Yes,
we are rule followers too.
Right. And I think that's again part of that, like, concept of school that we need to break and re-socialize.
And the reason behind it is a good thing. It's the desire to do a good job and to do it right, you know,
Right.
but sometimes that gets in the way.
And what's right? I mean, I think that's that.
Yeah.
We have to rethink what is right. Yeah, a little duct tape won't hurt us. If I'm evaluated today, they're not going to know whether it's okay.
Right. yeah, and maybe this is a good one to jump to this last slide that we had, where it says here, Heidi Cologne and her colleagues found that the more overlap there was between students' identity development outside school and the classroom's celebrated roles and identities, the easier and less threatening it was for students to step into the role of being a good student or smart student. Assessment in particular, evaluative grading, is often something done to students rather, I should say, than with them. But here's the sort of far out connection I was making with this and what we were just saying is like, school is a special place in terms of important, but we're all people, and we learn outside the classroom as much as in the classroom. And so I think about this, like, why not feed students curiosity in the classroom? Why not have authentic discussions with them in the classroom? Like, if I saw them at the grocery store, I would ask them an authentic question. So it's, I wouldn't have a script for that. And so I think about it as like, the more that our identity in the classroom can be our identity outside the classroom, and we can teach students as humans in our classroom the way we would work with them outside the classroom. I think it's a better, I think we have a better thing going on. But the questions that we have here, and is how might I bring in the positive identities students have inside or outside of school into the classroom or home? And how am I helping students to improve their self and peer assessments? How can I create more opportunities to practice these skills? I don't know if either of you have anything particular you want to share on that, or if I threw you a curveball and you want to add on to anything I said or disagree with me, you're welcome to.
I honestly struggled a little bit with this part of the book when I was thinking about identities. I mean, I guess I wasn't like getting it at first, but they talk about collaborativeness and helpfulness and how students have those roles, maybe with their siblings at home, and capitalizing on that in school. And I think when I think of my classroom, and collaboration was everything. And I think about the beginning of I think I said this before, the beginning of every year was just like, oh God, it was just so exhausting. Thinking about, how maybe they weren't so good at collaborating. It was a new group of kids who'd never been together before. But, for me, that was like such a priority, was getting them to work together.
One of the things that I found really powerful in terms of that identity was using concept mapping, where we use that in KnowAtom. And I loved that in terms of students would make connections that didn't necessarily make sense to me. So I could say, well, tell me about that, which that was great for my practice of, tell me about that. I don't understand. And they would have these amazing connections that came from somewhere else that they had lived, some life that they had experienced that I had no idea of. And that was their opportunity to be themselves and to understand something that they didn't necessarily understand in the reading, but then once they started just looking at a word, they didn't have to think about the reading anymore. Well, wait, I can connect to that. Does that? And we would get that a lot of times. It was so cool. Does that connect? And I'm like, well, listen to what you just said to me. Let's talk that again. And it gave students the opportunity to learn things about each other that, oh, that's amazing. Your parent does this, or you have an older brother that was going through this. And I felt like that was such an amazing opportunity for a student to feel like they mattered, and they might have a very different home life than everybody else. And suddenly they were bringing up something that everybody was really curious about and thought was really cool.
Mm-hmm.
And I found that as an incredibly powerful tool that helps students sort of, this is a part of me that I haven't shared,
Mm-hmm.
and could talk about that. That might be the only thing that they could connect on the entire piece of paper. All of the kids might have had many, many connections. And that was something that they could talk about with authority.
Mm-hmm.
I think the biggest way to kill something like that is to slap when you think about grading and assessment, is to slap a grade on it. And I think teachers are under so much pressure to have so many grades in a quarter, or,
Mm-hmm.
they don't let the learning be the learning. The learning becomes a grade for kids when a grade is slapped on it, and that's all the kid sees. They don't reflect on, like Judy, you were saying, how much the kid took away from it and the others took away from it. So when I think of that last quote, about assessment, so many times it becomes all about the grade and not about the learning behind it. And I think of, like, in KnowAtom, all the formative assessment things that we have, and gosh, that's the way it should be,
Yes.
focusing on the practice skills and having kids reflect on those practices, not on a grade.
Well, and that's why people get such great results when they use the program with integrity, because the focus is on
Thinking.
exactly that, the thinking, the skills, the practices, the dispositions, as opposed to things that really don't matter in so many ways,
Right.
like,
Right.
some de minimis fact, or, whatever. Where I went to in my mind on this, there's a couple different places. It's interesting. I thought about I've taught in very different profile communities, and I've through KnowAtom have worked in even broader profile communities, and sort of I feel like I've seen and been a part of like every permutation of things. And where my mind went here was, I would have parents come. I thought about parent-teacher conferences, and I thought about how I learn about students' home life in those parent-teacher conferences, and what their parents' views are, and how they view school, and what they kind of bring to the table, and what their relationship with their son or daughter is. And I remember in some cases, parents being like, when I was a student, we didn't need to do any of this, and so on and so forth. And what that lens brings to instruction and to work, and the value of work, when that's what students are hearing from their parents. And I think about the opportunity in that moment it is to help that parent see things a little differently, and help them understand why we take this approach, and what the value of it is, and what we're really focusing on, and how that can, by helping kind of reshape that parent's lens, reshapes the message that a child hears from their parents on an everyday basis about the value of school. Because I remember a parent being like, I never went to college, I never did this, I never did that. I don't think, scary, this was actually said, I don't think girls need to go to school. It's like, well, like, let's like unpack that here, and have that discussion. I think about other situations where parents would say things like, my student's not coming home with any homework. They don't have enough homework. Like, where's the homework in this science class? Like, how are they supposed to know all this stuff without enough homework? And then helping them to understand that we're using, and we're developing skills to develop and use content to solve problems and answer questions. And here's how that happens. And it happens hands-on, and it happens through discussions, and how that changes sort of the optic and helps bring that parent into the community of what we're doing in school. And those are kind of some, I guess, negative examples. But I think about a very positive example, which one of the communities that I worked with would have. It was around reading. They would have parent-teacher nights, and they would bring parents in, and they would use the students' data to show. And this was early. This was like in K2, K3 level, early elementary. They would show the parents sort of the words students had learned and their reading proficiency and sort of where they were in relation to grade level. And then what they would do is they would share techniques, and they would share vocabulary, and they would share different reading like books with the parents. And the parents were so excited because they could go home and they could use these techniques and they could use these books and they could read to their students, and they were able to engage their students in different ways than just like being kind of frustrated that their child couldn't read. They now could participate in helping their child reach a higher reading level. And we started doing the same thing in science. So we started helping teachers, helping parents ask questions with their students, like on the way to school, like what do you, instead of like how was school today, ask questions that were more pointed, like, I know from the newsletter that you're learning about this, like, have you seen any of the water cycle happening? How did you work with the water cycle? What sort of experiment or prototype did you create? Tell me more about that. And so helping involve the parent in that teaching process, sort of the connection of all of this around sort of sharing the school identity with home as being sort of an interesting angle where we can kind of bring things in and out, and even from an assessment standpoint, help the community at large assess the value of the experience that we're giving students in the classroom a bit differently. Because again, if it's all about the grade or about the homework or about some sort of task completion, it's like we miss a lot. So that was my reflection on this. And this is our last slide. So I think we covered a lot of ground. Was there anything either of you wanted to give for any kind of final takeaways, or we can wrap it up here?
No, I
I
think
think we've said a lot.
We said a lot. So with that said, I'll just wrap up here. Again, I'm Francis Vigent, my colleagues Lori and Judy. We hope that you enjoyed this time with us, and we'd encourage you to take a look at the slides online, those reflection questions, and share this with your team. Please take a look at the chapter if you have the time. You can visit KnowAtom.com or on X, formerly known as Twitter, at KnowAtom, or Facebook.com/KnowAtom. Thank you again. Have a great rest of your day.